Hello everyone. This video is about American light machine guns in the Second World War and specifically the Browning M1919A4 and its development into the A6 version and why this was needed. And to illustrate this, I have a very interesting experience report written by Captain Speirs, who is now famous for commanding Easy Company in the later stages of the Second World War. But in this report, written shortly after the war, he looks back at his experience in Normandy when he was a platoon leader. And it's a fascinating source that I hope to cover in more detail over on the main channel at a point in the future. But for now, I want to highlight a few comments he makes on the Browning M1919A4 as it was used at the squad level by the American paratroopers in the Normandy campaign. And some of the points he makes are very interesting as they explain why this development into the A6 was necessary. Now, before delving into this source, I do have to provide a little bit of technical background so everyone knows what I'm talking about with 1919, A4, A6. It can get a little bit confusing. So, to provide a little bit of background, these are the American Browning machine guns. And they're 30 caliber belt-fed machine guns, and it started in the First World War with the introduction of the M1917, not the 19, the 17, which was the American heavy water-cooled machine gun, which was similar to other designs of the time. So like the MG08, the Vickers, the Maxim, it's this heavy water-cooled tripod-mounted belt-fed machine gun, which is used for static fire support mostly. So they were typically used at the battalion level, and then they would provide long-range suppressive fires against area targets. And that was a good design, it was well liked. But like all heavy water-cooled machine guns, it was heavy. And to better attack across no man's land, you had to have more mobile firepower as well. So that is where the Americans introduced the BAR, that's the automatic rifle. So you have these two extremes of firepower. On the one hand you have the battalion level heavy machine guns, and then on the other extreme you have the squad level BARs, the Browning automatic rifles. And there's a large gap in between, and that's where then the 1919 comes in, which is a air-cooled modification of the 1917. And funnily enough, this actually starts out as a tank machine gun. It was actually quite a simple, somewhat hasty stopgap conversion of this water-cooled 1917 into a fairly simple air-cooled tank machine gun that was then developed late in the First World War, too late in fact. So it was just kind of left there in the interwar era as this air-cooled modification. And there it was then picked up by the cavalry and the infantry in the interwar era to fill this gap between the BAR and the 1917. And well, the 1919 wasn't perfect for it. There were actually quite a few technical downsides that resulted from this conversion from a water-cooled design into an air-cooled design. In hindsight, it probably would have been better to just start from scratch and develop a proper light machine gun. But yeah, the way it worked out, the 1919 was then adopted by the infantry in the A4 configuration, which was still tripod-mounted, belt-fed, air-cooled, and it was made for a bit of a medium support role. So, like I said, BAR squad level, 1917 battalion level, and then at the company level, the infantry adopted these 1919s, the A4, as a medium support weapon that would then provide fire support for the platoons and the squads to close in. And for that role, it still retained its tripod, and that's one of the trouble spots that will be highlighted in this report, is the tripod was a bit of a poor fit for such a light support weapon, as the tripod that was developed for the Browning A4 specifically was a very awkward compromise. It didn't really offer that much more than what a bipod would have given you, but it still gave you the size and the weight of a tripod, which was quite awkward to set up. You needed at least 2 men, you needed some open, flat space to put it down, and it just didn't give you a whole lot of traverse and elevation. which then leads to the A6 modification. So this is all the A4, that's the mass-produced version that was used throughout most of the Second World War with the tripod mount. And then quite soon in the Second World War, as combat experience comes in, the next development is from the A4 to the A6, which is mainly to make it a bit better suited to this more mobile, close support role for the infantry. And what the A6 mainly does is it adds a bipod to it, so you're not reliant on the tripod anymore. And it adds a shorter stock as well, so it's easier to fire by a single person from the bipod. And it adds a carrying handle, so you can pick it up on your own and even fire it using the carrying handle around the barrel. So these are all ergonomic improvements, and the internals don't really change that much. It's still the A4, and the A4 is still like the 1917 as well. So these are all related developments. These are all still being developed out of this original water-cooled heavy machine gun. On the A6, there are a few changes, like they make the barrel a little bit lighter. They add a muzzle booster as well to help with reliability and increase the rate of fire a little bit. And they also changed the mounting system for the barrel, so it is somewhat easier to swap out, but it's not a true quick change barrel in the sense that like the Bren gun or the MG42 had. So what all these improvements do is to mainly push the A4, which was already a lighter, more mobile version of the 1917, to push that into even more of a light machine gun role. And this is, it's approved, it's adopted as a limited standard in April 1943. And what this means is they know that they're not going to produce it in sufficient numbers to fully replace the A4. That only happens around the Korean War, that the A6 becomes the full standard. But in the Second World War, they adopted as a limited standard for a select few units. And the first ones to receive it are the parachute regiments. And that's for good reason, because the American paratroopers, they had a different type of organization compared to the regular infantry. And they used the Brownings, the 1919s, in a very different way. So the way the regular infantry was organized, like I said, you had the water-cooled 1917s at the battalion level, you have your BARs at the squad level, and then in between you had the company. They had 3 rifle platoons that closed with the enemy, and they had a 4th heavy platoon, and that's where the light mortars and the light machine guns were found. And this is more of a concentrated support role, and the paratroopers didn't like that at all, because they typically put around a platoon-sized unit in a single airplane. So if you put your entire heavy weapons platoon in a single plane and it goes down, then in one blow you lose all the company's heavy weapons. So right from the start, the paratroopers were all about dispersing these assets. So the mortars were pushed down to the platoon level, but then these Brownings, and this was still the 1919A4 by this point, they were integrated directly into the squad level, where they replaced the BAR. So very different from what the regular line infantry had. They only had the BAR as their squad automatic weapon, but the paratroopers, they had this much heavier 1919A4. And that's why the paratroopers are the first to complain, because they're really getting confronted by the downsides of the A4 in terms of its mobility and how cumbersome it is, because they're using it in much more of a dynamic way. It really is the base of fire for the squad to maneuver around, and that's not something that the regular infantry was confronted with, because they used it as a company fire support level. So being tripod mounted, being crew served wasn't such a big deal for the regular infantry, but for the airborne it was. And that's why they are then the ones who receive the first of this limited standard production of the A6, which happens in between Normandy and Market Garden. So it was already adopted in April 43, but it takes a little while to produce, and then it's only in the late summer of 44 that they actually, get it into the front line. And the following report by Speirs illustrates really well why the paratroopers didn't like the A4 configuration, especially in Normandy, and why they then received priority to get those first batches of the A6 in time for their next jump, which was Market Garden in September. So this report, to give a little bit of background, written by then Captain Speirs for the Advanced Infantry Officers course in 1948. And the assignment was that he had to analyze his own combat experience in the Second World War, and the action he picked to go through was when he was the platoon commander of 2nd Platoon of Dog Company of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. And it's an action that happened on the 13th of June 1944 outside of Carentan. And the first thing I want to go over is the organization, how he describes it. So I've already covered it a little bit, but this is how Speirs describes the Airborne squad platoon company organization, but also how he specifically in the field had to modify his platoon to deal with the losses, because not only had they been in combat and suffered casualties, but the very chaotic night drop on Normandy also meant a lot of men and weapons had gone missing. So his platoon was actually just down to 15 men, so a reinforced squad. So to quote Speirs, the rifle companies had 3 identical rifle platoons and a company headquarters, but no weapons platoon. Instead, each rifle platoon had only 2 rifle squads and a 60mm mortar squad. Each 12-man rifle squad had a light machine gun team organic to it. The 2nd Platoon 60mm mortar had been lost on the parachute jump, but no loss resulted because our depleted strength would not have allowed the platoon to operate it. Riflemen were needed much more than mortarmen. Only 1 light machine gun was carried because the platoon leader felt that riflemen were more valuable during the constant attacking in which we had been engaged. Our light machine guns during the Normandy campaign were not provided with the bipod, but only a tripod, which was not satisfactory while attacking in Hedgerow country. So, very interesting that he makes the deliberate choice to trade firepower for manpower. He already lost the mortar, but he could have retained both his light machine guns. The Airborne platoon had 2 squads, both with 1 light machine gun. He had both of them, but given the manpower shortage he found himself with, and also the sort of fighting they were engaged in, this close-range hedgerow fighting, he made the choice to discard one of those machine guns, only retain a single one for his base of fire, and that would then free up more riflemen, both from the mortar squad, but then also the crew from the machine gun from one of the squads. And what's even more interesting is he's not just discarding weapons, but he's also picking them up, because later on in the report he actually mentions that they acquired a BAR. And that is something that you see quite often in these reports from paratroopers, is they keep getting their hands on BARs, even though they shouldn't according to their paper organization. The BAR is nowhere to be found in the parachute troops. It's all about those 1919s as their primary automatic weapon. But yeah, they like using BARs. Maybe they got them from the glider troops, they still used BARs. But anyway, this really got to the point that in December 1944 it was actually formalized, and then the BAR is assigned on paper to the paratrooper squads as well. They don't actually assign a dedicated operator to it, it is just a weapon given to the squad, and then it is given to one of the riflemen who trades his Carentan for the BAR. But it's interesting that already in the field you see this improvised use of the BAR to supplement the 1919, and that's then formalized later that year. So to move on to the tactical action here, like I said, it's the 13th of June outside Carentan, and the Americans have captured the town and they're trying to extend their perimeter. But on the same day, the Germans launch a big counterattack, and Speirs and his platoon are caught right in the middle of it, and it's a bit of a confused meeting engagement where Speirs is leading his force on an attack, but at the same time the Germans are enveloping his flanks, and the entire situation turns around, as you will see. And the mission he is given from his company commander is to capture an isolated farmhouse that is a little down the hill from the American lines, in between some orchards and hedgerows. And what's important to keep in mind is it's a single stone farmhouse, but it has a waist-high stone wall around it, forming a courtyard, and that's going to play an important role in the upcoming firefight. To quote from Speirs, "The platoon reached the stone wall surrounding the house at the bottom of the hill, vaulted the wall and found the courtyard empty. As the platoon leader crossed the waist-high wall, he looked back up the hill and saw German soldiers running along the hedgerow he had just left. The machine gun was quickly mounted, firing through a gate in the stone wall. The automatic rifle was placed on the wall and heavy fire was rained on this threat. Screams of pain were heard and many casualties inflicted on this unit of the enemy. The enemy returned fire, but the stone wall protected the platoon. A German machine gun began firing from the hill at the machine gunner as he lay exposed behind the gate. The platoon machine gunner was killed and the machine gun rendered useless." So, yeah, there you have a clear example of the downside of the tripod having to be mounted outside the cover of the wall behind a gate, because the wall itself just didn't allow for the tripod to be mounted. It's too narrow of a surface. And it's the same problem with those Norman hedgerows, that they also have a small embankment in them as well. So it's just very awkward to put this low fixed tripod, which you can't adjust in height, behind those. And that means that a lot of cover just cannot be used by a machine gun if you want to set it up on the tripod. And Speirs, in his lessons learned at the end of the report, also highlights this technical shortcoming of the A4, to quote, "The LMG was equipped with a tripod but no bipod. The separate tripod was almost useless when units were attacking in hedgerow country." And you see the contrast quite clearly also in his report between the tripod of the A4 and then the more rifle-like ergonomics of the BAR in the following sentence, to quote, "The machine gun was quickly mounted, firing through a gate in the stone wall. The automatic rifle was placed on the wall." So again, shows that the tripod doesn't allow for a firing position on the wall, whereas the shoulder-fired BAR does. And that's of course what the big improvement in the 1919A6 is they give it a bipod, they give it a shoulder stock, so it gets the ergonomics to then be used more dynamically from different types of cover and not just flat on the ground, which was the case with the tripod. Now, you may be wondering, was there really no other way than the tripod to use the A4? And that is a good point, and that is actually covered in the training manuals as well. And that is something I do want to highlight here, is that this wasn't just a technical issue with the weapon itself, but training played a part as well, and perhaps too rigid thinking in the way these machine guns were used, which didn't really translate into the way the paratroopers were using them. So that is one possible explanation here, is that using the training manuals of the time, they really emphasized the machine gun in its fire support role, firing from the tripod almost all the time, whereas the squad level use that the paratroopers used it called for more dynamic use, which also involved firing it outside of its tripod. And that is something that gets more emphasis in the post-war manual as combat experience comes in. So in the wartime manual, you don't really see a whole lot of emphasis being placed on firing the Browning outside of its tripod. But then in the FM 2355, which is published in July 1945, there's actually, for example, an illustration showing assault fire, which is done with the A4, but you can do it with the A6 as well, where you're just picking up the machine gun without the tripod, holding it by the barrel with a protective glove or a carrying handle, and then just firing it from the hip as you're advancing. And the manual recommends doing this in woodland, in urban environment, when you are attacking through smoke. So that is a legitimate way to get the machine gun forward while providing protective suppressive fire. And it also has an interesting piece of advice which seems to apply to this specific Normandy situation as well, and that is, under varying conditions in battle, expedients such as resting the barrel jacket in the fork of a tree or a notch in a wall or over the limb of a tree may be useful. So there it says already, like, you don't have to use the tripod if the situation doesn't allow it, just getting the weapon into position on any piece of available cover, any sort of firing platform that you can put the barrel jacket on, can be useful for just getting the fire out there. And that is perhaps a limitation in training of the paratroopers before they went into Normandy, that they still trained on their machine guns more in the fire support role, that the regular infantry used them at the company level, whereas the squad level offensive combat in close countries, such as the Hedgerows, really called for this more dynamic use, switching between tripod mount and then outside of the tripod, just firing from whatever cover is available. So not only was this presumably improved in training, because the post-war manual emphasizes these techniques much more than the wartime manual, but of course the technical update also came along. So the A6 and the improvements it makes greatly increase the ease with which the weapon can be used outside of its tripod as well. So that's really the interesting thing here, is this evolution in use, both in the actual hardware of the weapon, so the design, how it changes from the A4 to the A6, but also the software, how the training gets updated, the different types of organization. The BAR being used alongside it, I think, is also very interesting. So yeah, I think that is really the common theme here, is how these weapons are pushed into new roles, and then understandably the friction that creates as when a weapon is pushed into a role it wasn't designed for. Because you got to keep in mind, this is still the water-cooled 1917 at its core, which was then hastily modified into a tank machine gun, which was then picked up by the infantry, modified into the A4 for company level support, which was then adopted by the Airborne for squad level support. So these are some very sort of rapidly changing mission sets that this weapon is being forced into. So of course there's going to be friction where a weapon just isn't designed for that role, and it takes a little while, and it requires combat experience, as Speirs went through, to really fine-tune those weapons for those new roles, which then leads to eventually a weapon like the 1919A6, which still wasn't perfect, but at least it fit better into this light general purpose machine gun that the Americans were looking for, until they could replace it with the M60, which was then designed from the ground up to really be built for that type of fighting. So, like I said, I do plan to use this source for a more detailed view over on the main channel in a Teaching Tactics episode at some point. But hopefully for now this has been just an interesting, more narrow look at the machine gun use specifically, and how that then evolved as combat experience came in. Thanks for watching.